The Rogue Prince, the full story of Daemon Targaryen. There are names in the history of Westeros that carry weight simply by being spoken. Names that conjure fire, blood, and legend in equal measure. Among all the sons and daughters of House Targaryen, few names stir as much fascination, controversy, and quiet awe as that of Daemon Targaryen. He was a man built from contradictions, a prince of the blood who felt more at home in the gutters of Flea Bottom than in the halls of the Red Keep. A knight gifted one of the most legendary swords in the world, who used it with the same ease against lords as against criminals. A husband who despised his first wife openly and married his own niece in secret. A brother who craved approval he could never quite hold on to. A father who loved his children fiercely, even as he burned down the world around them. To his enemies, he was reckless, dangerous, and utterly without restraint, a man who treated the laws of gods and kings as inconveniences to be ignored. To those who loved him, he was something else entirely. A protector, a warrior without equal, a man whose loyalty ran deeper than the sea itself, even when he hid it behind arrogance and cruelty. History gave him a fitting name. They called him the Rogue Prince. This is his story, from the moment he was born beneath the shadow of a legendary king, through the wars he fought for glory, the marriages that defined and haunted him, the family he built and broke, and finally to the war that would consume half his family and end his life in the cold waters of a lake whose name would become legend. Part 1. Born into a Kingdom of Peace. To understand Daemon Targaryen, you first have to understand the world that received him. The year was 81 after Aegon's conquest. Westeros had been ruled by dragons and Targaryens for 8 decades, and under the current king Jaehaerys I, a man history would come to call the Old King or the Conciliator, the realm had settled into an era of extraordinary peace. Jaehaerys had spent more than 3 decades on the Iron Throne building roads, codifying laws, mending old rivalries between great houses through careful marriages and diplomacy. Dragons still soared above King's Landing and Dragonstone, but they were no longer weapons of daily war. They had become something closer to living monuments, symbols of a power that had grown almost ceremonial in its stability. It was into this world of settled order that Daemon was born, the second son of Prince Balon Targaryen and Princess Alyssa Targaryen. Balon was known as the Spring Prince, a dragon rider celebrated for his vigor, his courage, and his skill in battle. Alyssa was every bit his match, wild-spirited, fearless in the sky, utterly devoted to the freedom that dragonback flight offered. Daemon's older brother, Viserys, was the family's golden child, steady, dutiful, handsome, and utterly predictable, everything a future king was supposed to be. Their sisters Daela and Alysanne were gentle and proper, destined for careful political marriages of their own. And then there was Daemon, the second son of a second son, a boy born into a role that was meant to be safe, quiet, and entirely unremarkable, third in line to a throne that would almost certainly never be his. But peace on the surface hid something else entirely underneath. The blood that ran through House Targaryen was never a calm thing. It was a river of ambition, pride, and fire, and Daemon had inherited more of it than most. From his earliest days there was something restless in him, an energy that could not be tamed by lessons, ceremony, or the careful hands of royal tutors. He was, in the truest sense, a child of the sky rather than the earth. Within a fortnight of his birth, his mother carried him aloft on dragonback, an old and rare Targaryen custom reserved only for infants judged strong enough to endure it. That early experience of wind, height, and raw draconic power may have planted the very first seed of the hunger that would define the rest of his life. A hunger for freedom, for dominance, for something beyond the walls that everyone else seemed content to live within. As a boy, Daemon roamed the ancient corridors of the Red Keep, a fortress built stone by dragon lords, its halls echoing with centuries of conquest and tragedy. He felt the weight of that history pressing down on him even as a child, the expectation that every prince born into Valyrian blood had to somehow measure up to legends like Aegon the Conqueror or Visenya the warrior queen. Where his siblings and cousins seemed to accept their destinies with quiet grace, Daemon chafed against every boundary placed in front of him. He preferred the company of stable boys and servants to that of lords and maesters. He slipped away from the Red Keep whenever he could, wandering down into the city of King's Landing itself, and eventually into Flea Bottom, the poorest, most dangerous district of the capital, where the small folk lived and died far removed from the gilded councils of the court. This wasn't simple rebellion. It was something closer to a desperate need to understand what existed beyond the walls of his own privileged cage. Even in these early years, the qualities that would define him were unmistakable. He was clever with a blade far beyond his years, quick to laugh and quicker still to anger. He could charm a highborn lady or a common tavern girl with equal ease, and could just as easily insult a great lord without a flicker of hesitation. His grandfather, King Jaehaerys, watched him with a mixture of pride and deep concern. The old king had lived through the fall of too many brilliant, reckless Targaryens, men and women who burned bright and burned out far too fast. He tried to guide Daemon toward patience, toward duty, but the lessons never quite took root. Daemon respected his grandfather, he may even have loved him, but he could never bring himself to imitate the old king's careful, measured way of ruling. He was not built for peace. And so, in the very soil of his birth, in the earliest days of his childhood, the seed of the rogue prince had already been planted, not out of pure defiance, but simply because it was who he was. The Red Keep of Daemon's boyhood was a place thick with memory. Every stone had been laid by Dragonlord's command, every tapestry told the story of a conquest or a tragedy, and every hallway seemed to whisper the names of the ancestors a young prince was expected to live up to: Aegon the Conqueror, who had unified the realm through fire and marriage; Visenya, the warrior queen whose blade Daemon would one day carry; Meager the Cruel, whose reign had nearly torn the dynasty apart through sheer brutality. Even Aenys the Weak, whose failures were spoken of only in careful whispers. To be born a Targaryen was to be born already carrying the full weight of that history, and Daemon felt it pressing down on him from the earliest age he could remember. His father, Balon, tried in his own way to guide him. The Spring Prince was himself a man of considerable energy and courage, and there were moments in the training yard or on Dragonback when father and son seemed to understand each other completely. But Balon died relatively young from a burst appendix that no Maester could treat in time. When Daemon was still a boy, another loss that hardened something in him even before he had fully grown into the man he would become. His mother, Alyssa, doted on him in the way she doted on all her wild, dragon-blooded children, but she too passed while Daemon was still young, leaving him without the two figures who might have shaped his temper into something gentler. It fell instead to his grandfather, King Jaehaerys, to try to civilize the boy, and the old king, for all his wisdom, found Daemon to be perhaps the single most difficult of all his many grandchildren. Jaehaerys had spent his entire reign trying to build something that would outlast him. A stable, prosperous, unified 7 kingdoms, held together not through fear but through careful diplomacy and patient law. He had watched, over the course of his long life, as brilliant, dangerous Targaryens burned themselves out, reckless dragon riders, ambitious usurpers, tyrants who mistook cruelty for strength. He recognized in his grandson the same volatile fire, and he worried quietly and constantly about what that fire might eventually consume. And so the old king tried. He assigned tutors, arranged for extra training with the finest swordsmen in the capital, invited Daemon to sit in on small council sessions long before he was of an age to truly understand them, hoping that early exposure to the machinery of governance might instill some sense of duty. None of it worked in quite the way Jaehaerys hoped. Daemon absorbed the swordplay eagerly, excelling far beyond what was expected of a boy his age. But the political lessons slid off him entirely. He respected his grandfather, perhaps even loved him in the complicated way that Daemon loved most people in his life, but he could never bring himself to become a smaller, calmer version of the old king. He was, from the very beginning, someone else entirely. Part 2: The Dragon and the Blade. Every Targaryen prince and princess dreams of the day they claim a dragon of their own. For Daemon, that day would prove to be more significant than most. The dragon he claimed was Carax's, a lean, aggressive, blood-red beast with an unusually long, serpentine neck and a roar capable of rattling castle walls. Carax's had once belonged to Daemon's uncle, Prince Aemon Targaryen, a warrior of considerable renown who had flown the dragon through decades of royal service, including skirmishes against pirates and long journeys beyond the wall. When Aemon was killed fighting pirates in the Stepstones, Carax's returned alone to Dragonstone, riderless, and by every account more volatile and dangerous than ever in his grief. No precise record survives of exactly how the bond between Daemon and Carax's was formed. What survives are whispers and legend, that a boy barely old enough to understand the meaning of caution walked alone into the dragon's lair beneath Dragonstone's volcanic heart. No handlers, no chains, no offerings of meat to earn the beast's trust. He simply entered the darkness, and hours later emerged with the massive red dragon following him as faithfully as a hound. However it happened, the bond that formed between them was different from most dragon and rider pairings. Where other riders controlled their mounts through careful signal and discipline, Daemon and Carax's seemed to move as a single will. The dragon's tendency to strike first and consider consequences later mirrored Daemon's own impulsive, mercurial nature perfectly. In combat, Carax's fought with a violence most dragons reserved only for their most desperate moments, and Daemon, far from reining that violence in, pushed it further, reveling in the chaos the two of them created together. It wasn't simply a partnership of convenience. It was closer to a mirror. Every flash of Daemon's anger, every surge of his ambition, every moment of cruelty or unexpected warmth seemed to be felt and reflected back by his dragon. When Daemon was restless, Caraxes stirred in his lair. When Daemon felt triumphant, Caraxes would take to the sky in wide, aggressive spirals. And when Daemon was wounded, whether by a blade or by his own family, the dragon would growl low and long, a sound that seemed to promise vengeance on his behalf. But a Targaryen prince needed more than a dragon to be taken seriously as a warrior. He needed a blade worthy of his name. In the year 97 AC, at the age of 16, Daemon was knighted by his grandfather, King Jaehaerys, in a formal ceremony held in the royal sept of the Red Keep. Those who watched noted how still and composed the young prince remained throughout the ritual, a boy who had trained since he could hold a wooden sword, drilling for years in the training yard against men twice his age, now finally being recognized for what he had already become. But the true significance of that day came after the vows were spoken. From a velvet-lined chest, Jaehaerys drew out a sword that seemed to swallow the light of the room around it, a blade of rippled, dark Valyrian steel, its hilt built for speed rather than brute strength. This was Dark Sister, one of only 2 Valyrian steel blades the Targaryens had carried out of old Valyria, originally wielded centuries earlier by Queen Rhaena Targaryen, the fierce warrior queen who had ridden Hagar and helped conquer the 7 kingdoms herself. Dark Sister had not passed to a living man in generations. It had waited in the royal armory, a relic of a fiercer age for a wielder who could match its spirit. In gifting it to Daemon, Jaehaerys was making a statement to the entire court. This boy, whatever his flaws, was being recognized as the heir to House Targaryen's warrior tradition, the mantle once worn by Rhaena and later by Prince Aemon himself. Daemon accepted the blade, felt its perfect, unfamiliar balance in his hand, and for the first time understood exactly what it meant to carry a piece of his ancestors' legacy into every battle still to come. Over the following decades, he would live up to that promise entirely, carving his legend from the training yards of King's Landing to the blood-soaked beaches of the Stepstones. But before any of that could happen, the old king had one more piece to place on the board, a marriage meant to tie the restless young prince down. Part 3: A Cage Wrapped in Silk. In that same year, 97 AC, Daemon's marriage was arranged by his grandfather to Lady Rhea Royce, heir to House Royce of Runestone, one of the oldest and proudest houses of the Vale. For a king who valued stability above almost everything else, the match made perfect political sense. The Royces had held their seat since the Age of Heroes, their bronze armor and rune-etched shields a living connection to the First Men. Binding such a house more firmly to the Targaryen dynasty seemed, on paper, a wise and sensible move. For Daemon, it was nothing short of a cage wrapped in silk. From the moment he first arrived in the Vale, he made his contempt for the place unmistakable. He called it a land of nothing but rock and sheep, a deliberate insult toward the mountainous, mist-covered landscape the Vale lords took immense pride in. To him, everything about the region was dull and provincial. The endless gray skies, the clinging mountain fog, the slow rhythms of shepherds and merchants who had never once glimpsed the glittering ambition of King's Landing. And then there was Rhea herself. She was a woman of the Vale through and through, practical, stoic, and entirely unimpressed by a dragon prince's swagger. She did not swoon in his presence or seek his approval. She wore bronze armor as naturally as Daemon wore black leather, and she managed her family's lands with a quiet competence that only seemed to deepen his disdain. He did not hide his contempt. Within the halls of Runestone itself, he spoke openly of the marriage as a punishment, a dull exile from the court he actually wanted to be part of. He referred to his own wife not by her name but by a cruel nickname built from her house's sigil, a slight that shocked even the hardened lords of the Vale who overheard it. When he wasn't outright insulting her, he was simply absent flying Caraxes over the peaks of the Mountains of the Moon, or brooding alone in Runestone's cold chambers, dreaming of the throne he believed should have been his birthright. The political failure of the marriage was, in hindsight, inevitable. A marriage requires 2 people willing to build something together, and Daemon was determined to tear the entire arrangement down from the inside. He refused outright to give her a child, a deliberate act of sabotage that left the Royce succession dangerously uncertain, since Rhea needed an heir of her own to secure her claim to Runestone. He petitioned King Jaehaerys for an annulment. When that failed, he later turned to his brother Viserys. Once Viserys had ascended the throne, hoping for a different answer. Each time the response was the same: no. No dragon's roar, no sword's edge, and no amount of resentment could break the bonds of duty that this marriage had placed on him. That simmering frustration would color nearly every decision Daemon made for the next decade. It is worth pausing on Rhea herself for a moment because history, written almost entirely by those loyal to Daemon or to the Targaryen court, has rarely been kind to her memory. She was not a villain in this story, nor a fool, nor the dull provincial figure Daemon liked to portray her as in his cruelest moments. She was, by every surviving account, a capable and independent woman who managed her family's lands with genuine skill, who rode and hunted as well as any man in the Vale, and who simply refused to perform the kind of adoring, deferential wifely role that a prince as vain as Daemon expected from any woman in his life. In another marriage to another man, her strengths might have been celebrated. Bound instead to a husband who resented his own marriage from its very first day, those same qualities became, in his eyes, further proof of everything he despised about the match. There is a particular cruelty in how thoroughly Daemon erased her from his own account of his life. In the years that followed, when bards and chroniclers came to sing of the rogue prince's many marriages and love affairs, Rhea Royce was almost always mentioned only in passing, as an obstacle rather than a person, a cage he had to escape rather than a woman he had wronged. Whatever grief or resentment she carried during those long years of near-total abandonment at Runestone, waiting for a husband who never wrote and rarely visited, went almost entirely unrecorded. It is one of the quieter tragedies buried within the larger, louder tragedy of Daemon's life, that his restlessness so often came at a cost paid by people history barely bothered to remember. Part 4: The Small Council and the Making of an Enemy. When King Jaehaerys died and Daemon's brother ascended the Iron Throne as King Viserys I in the year 103 AC, Daemon expected to finally be given a role worthy of his blood, to stand at his brother's right hand as the king's most trusted advisor. Viserys, hoping that responsibility might finally settle his restless younger brother, offered him a seat on the small council as Master of Coin. Daemon accepted, if only because no better offer had presented itself. For a few weeks he performed the role with something resembling diligence, reviewing ledgers, sitting through tedious debates on tariffs and silver coinage. But the tedium of administration proved to be a slow poison to a man who thrived on chaos and swordplay. The endless discussions over grain shipments and tax reform felt like drudgery dressed up as governance, and his attention drifted constantly toward the window, toward the sky where Caraxes circled, toward the streets below where real life pulsed without the stifling decorum of court. Before long, Daemon began treating the royal treasury as something closer to his own personal purse. He redirected funds meant for the city watch toward his own projects, levied punishing taxes on the brothels of Flea Bottom with the casual cruelty of a man who viewed coin as little more than a toy, and drafted decrees that favored his own allies over the interests of the crown. He treated the realm's gold as though it were simply an extension of his own inheritance, and in some private part of his mind he likely believed exactly that. It was during this period that his rivalry with Otto Hightower, the king's hand, hardened into something close to open hostility. Otto was a man of order, protocol, and careful, patient ambition. In Daemon he saw not a prince but a threat, a wild card with too much ambition and far too little restraint, a man who could unravel decades of careful stability if left unchecked. Every reckless expenditure Daemon made, every sharp word he muttered in council, Otto quietly recorded, building a case against the rogue prince one incident at a time. The friction between them escalated by the week. Daemon openly mocked Otto's solemn, careful manner, dismissed his counsel in front of the entire council, and once suggested in front of witnesses that the hand of the king would be better suited to needlework than to governing a kingdom. Otto said nothing in response because he didn't need to. He already had the king's ear, and Viserys, for all his love of his brother, was not blind to Daemon's behavior. Hoping to redirect his brother's energy into something more useful, Viserys shifted Daemon into the role of Master of Laws instead. But law, like finance, demanded patience and precision that Daemon simply didn't possess. He rewrote statutes to suit his own whims, dismissed court cases with a wave of his hand, and spent far more time in the taverns along the Street of Silk than in his own chambers. Otto continued whispering to the king in private, warning him of Daemon's untrustworthiness and his growing potential to become a rallying point for dissent within the realm. After only a matter of months, Daemon resigned the position with a smirk, making clear that he had no intention of being tamed by a chair, a quill, and a stack of legal codes. The experiment of folding Daemon into the machinery of government had failed completely. He was not made for ledgers. He was made for battle, for chaos, for fire, and King's Landing itself, with its narrow, crowded streets and hidden dangers, was about to offer him exactly the kind of outlet he craved. Part 5: The Gold Cloaks and the King of Flea Bottom. In the year 103 AC, King Viserys appointed Daemon as commander of the City Watch of King's Landing, a role that at first glance seemed like a demotion dressed up as a gift. The City Watch at the time was a ragtag, corrupt force mismatched in armor, armed with rusted weapons and more interested in shaking down merchants than actually keeping the peace. To most of the court, it was a joke. To Daemon, it was an army without a lord, a weapon simply waiting to be forged. He threw himself into the task with the same intensity he'd once shown climbing into Carax's lair. Within weeks, the Watch was unrecognizable. He drilled the men from dawn until dusk, dismissed the corrupt old captains who had long profited from bribery, and replaced them with officers who feared him more than they had ever feared losing their positions. He demanded discipline and loyalty above all else, and he gave every member of the Watch a new, unmistakable uniform, a heavy cloak of golden cloth trimmed in black. The gold cloaks, as they came to be known, became both an identity and a badge of fear throughout the capital. Under Daemon's command, the Watch swept through Flea Bottom, dragging thieves and murderers out of the alleys they had once ruled unopposed. They did not negotiate. Crime in the capital dropped sharply and the city grew visibly safer for the first time in living memory, though the cost paid largely in the blood of those who resisted was steep. Daemon called it order. The small folk had a different name for it, the reign of the gold cloaks. But there was a deeper purpose forming beneath the surface of this transformation. Every man in the Watch swore loyalty to Daemon personally rather than to the crown itself. They became his eyes and ears in every brothel and hovel across the city. And it was in Flea Bottom, moving among thieves and cutthroats and the desperate poor, that Daemon met Mysaria, a pale, sharp-eyed dancer originally from Lies, who had been sold into servitude as a child and had clawed her way into building a life and a network of secrets entirely her own. She became his lover, his confidant, and eventually his most valuable spy, helping him weave together an intelligence network that reached into the very walls of the Red Keep itself. Through Mysaria, Daemon began to learn things no prince was supposed to know: which lord was gambling away his family's keep, which knight was keeping secrets from his own household, which merchant was quietly defrauding the crown. Some of it he used immediately. Much of it he simply hoarded, a silent leverage waiting for the right moment to be spent. Meanwhile, Daemon's personal reputation among the common people of King's Landing grew into something close to genuine devotion. He did not look down on the poor the way most highborn lords did. He walked among them, drank in their taverns, and when it suited him, intervened directly on their behalf, whether against an abusive landlord or a corrupt guardsman. The small folk began to see him not merely as a prince, but as something closer to a protector, even as the great lords of the realm watched his growing influence with mounting alarm. Otto Hightower warned Viserys directly that Daemon was quietly building a shadow army loyal only to himself, that his presence in Flea Bottom was becoming a cancer on the city's governance. Viserys, ever reluctant to confront his brother directly, chose to see only a man who had finally found purpose, not a prince sharpening a blade in the dark. By the end of it, Daemon had become something of a walking contradiction, cheered as a hero in the taverns of Flea Bottom, cursed as a destabilizing menace in the solars of the Red Keep. He seemed, if anything, to relish that contradiction entirely. Part 6: The Heir for a Day. In the year 105 AC, tragedy struck the royal family in a way that would permanently reshape the line of succession. Queen Aemma Arryn, King Viserys' wife, had endured several miscarriages over the years, each one carving deeper lines of grief into the king's face. When she finally went into a difficult labor in the early spring of that year, the entire court held its breath, desperate for a healthy male heir. The birth itself was brutal. The Maesters, in a last desperate effort to save the child, were forced to cut the queen open. The procedure saved the newborn boy at the cost of his mother's life. Queen Aemma died within hours. The infant prince named Balon lived barely a single day before his own weak lungs gave out. The realm mourned deeply and Viserys was left utterly hollowed out, having lost both his wife and his newborn son within the space of a single night. In the days that followed, Daemon, once again the presumptive heir to the throne now that Viserys had no living son, made a decision that would permanently damage his relationship with his brother. Gathering with close companions, including Mysaria, at a rowdy tavern in the Street of Silk, he raised a cup and offered a toast to the heir for a day. Meant perhaps as a dark, sardonic joke aimed as much at his own renewed position in the succession as at the dead infant, the words were nonetheless overheard by servants and spies, and within a fortnight they had reached King Viserys' ears. The king's reaction was immediate and total. What Daemon had intended as a crude jest, Viserys saw as a public mockery of his dead wife and child. proof, in his mind, that his brother had no respect for the crown, for family, or for the most basic bonds of blood. Viserys summoned Daemon before the entire court, stripped him of his command of the city watch and banished him from King's Landing, ordering him back to his estranged wife in the Vale, a punishment Daemon considered far worse than exile itself. But Viserys wasn't finished. In a decision that would reshape the future of the Seven Kingdoms entirely, he chose not to name Daemon his heir. Instead, he named his young daughter, 8-year-old Princess Rhaena Targaryen, as Princess of Dragonstone and his rightful successor to the Iron Throne. No woman had ever sat the Iron Throne before, and many lords across the realm would argue that none ever should. But Viserys was determined above all else to prevent his volatile brother from ever holding true power, and he forced every lord and lady in Westeros to swear oaths of fealty to Rhaenyra as his heir. Furious and humiliated, Daemon mounted Caraxes and flew not to the Vale as ordered but to Dragonstone, the ancient seat of House Targaryen, where he brooded alone over everything he had lost in a single drunken night. But Daemon Targaryen was not a man who accepted defeat quietly. As he stared out at the black stone walls of Dragonstone rising against the sea, he had already begun to plan his next move, and in the shadows of King's Landing, a woman known as the White Worm was already moving to help him. It is worth dwelling for a moment on just how much damage a single night of drunken bravado managed to inflict on the entire future of the Seven Kingdoms. Had Daemon simply stayed home that evening, had he mourned quietly rather than celebrating loudly in a flea-bottom brothel, the entire course of Targaryen history might have unfolded differently. He would very likely have remained his brother's heir. There would have been no need for Viserys to break centuries of tradition by naming a daughter as his successor. There would have been no Rhaenyra crowned Princess of Dragonstone, no rival claim for the Greens to rally behind decades later, and quite possibly no Dance of the Dragons at all. Instead, a single toast, spoken half in jest and half in genuine bitterness, set in motion a chain of consequences that would eventually consume nearly the entire royal family. It is one of the strange, almost darkly comic ironies of Daemon's life that so much of what defined him, his exiles, his wars, his eventual marriage to the woman named heir specifically to spite him, traced back not to some grand act of villainy or ambition, but to his own inability in a moment of genuine grief and confusion to simply keep his mouth shut. Those who study the Dance of the Dragons closely have long debated whether the war was truly inevitable from the moment Rhaenyra was born a girl in a society unwilling to accept a queen, or whether it was Daemon himself, through this one reckless night, who lit the fuse that everything afterwards simply followed. Part 7: The Stolen Egg and the White Worm. In the months that followed his banishment, rumors began to spread that a dragon egg had gone missing from the Dragonmont at Dragonstone, not just any egg, but a pale one veined with gold meant for a royal cradle. The loss was a humiliation for the crown, and suspicion fell heavily on Daemon, whose reputation for recklessness and defiance made him an easy target for blame. The suspicion was, in fact, entirely correct. Daemon had taken the egg not for himself but as a tool. He passed it to Mysaria, instructing her to smuggle it out of King's Landing and use it to secure funding for ambitions he had not yet revealed to anyone. When Viserys discovered the theft, his fury was immediate, driven less by the loss of the egg itself than by the insult, the implication that his brother would treat a sacred symbol of Targaryen legacy as nothing more than a bargaining chip. By this point, Mysaria had become far more than simply Daemon's lover. She had grown into perhaps the single most important figure in his entire private network, a woman whose own life story mirrored, in its own way, the same defiance and reinvention that defined Daemon's. Sold into servitude as a child in lies and brought across the narrow sea with nothing to her name, she had clawed her way out of that life through sheer intelligence and an unmatched gift for reading people. She spoke several languages fluently, understood the subtle currents of court politics as well as any maester, and possessed a kind of unshakable calm that Daemon, for all his charisma, could never quite manage himself. Where he acted on impulse, she planned meticulously. Where he burned bridges in fits of temper, she quietly rebuilt them behind his back, often without his knowledge or thanks. It was this combination, his fire and her patience, that made their partnership so effective for so many years. Through her contacts among the Lysine merchant houses, Mysaria had already begun mapping the trade networks and internal politics of the Triarchy long before Daemon ever set foot in the Stepstones, intelligence that would prove invaluable once the war for those islands finally began. She knew which Triarchy officials could be bribed and which were fanatically loyal, which shipping lanes were lightly guarded and which bristled with hidden defenses, while Daemon rode Caraxes into the fighting itself, earning the glory and the songs that would follow him for the rest of his life. It was very often Mysaria's quiet work in the shadows that made his victories possible in the first place, a debt history has rarely bothered to fully acknowledge. Summoned to Dragonstone for a cold, sharp confrontation, Daemon stood before the ancient stone throne of Aegon the Conqueror and denied nothing. He spoke instead of the Stepstones, of a war he intended to wage against the pirates choking the region's trade routes, and of the gold such a war would require. Viserys, pale with anger, demanded the egg's return. Daemon, smiling without any real warmth, agreed. But the damage to the brothers' relationship was already done, and what almost no one in King's Landing understood was that the stolen egg had never truly been the point. While Daemon rode Caraxes into whatever conflict lay ahead, Mysaria had already begun quietly mapping the intelligence networks of the Triarchy, the alliance of free cities that controlled the Stepstones, feeding Daemon information that would keep him a step ahead of his enemies for years to come. She had become, in effect, the invisible hand behind nearly all of his coming victories. Part 8: An Alliance is Forged. Not long after, a sealed letter arrived at Dragonstone bearing the seal of House Velaryon. Lord Corlys Velaryon, known across the realm as the Sea Snake for his legendary voyages and his vast trading fleet, was requesting a private meeting, away from the prying eyes of the court. Daemon didn't hesitate. He flew to the meeting on Caraxes and found Corlys waiting on a windswept rocky shore. The two men, each nursing their own grievances against the crown, spoke plainly. The Stepstones, a chain of barren, sun-scorched islands strangling the trade routes between Westeros and Essos, had fallen under the control of the Triarchy, an alliance of 3 free cities whose raiders had grown bold enough to attack the shores of the 7 kingdoms directly. Merchant ships were being burned. Villages were being sacked, and King Viserys, counseled by Otto Hightower to avoid the cost and risk of war, had done nothing. For Corlys, every ship lost to the Triarchy's raiders was a direct blow to his fortune and his pride. For Daemon, the crown's inaction was simply more proof of the same cowardice he'd witnessed for years in the small council chambers. On that shore, without any formal treaty or royal sanction, the two men forged an alliance. Corlys would fund the war with his ships and his gold. Daemon would lead it, bringing his dragon, his sword, and an appetite for glory that had been denied him for far too long. Together, they would raise a private army made up of exiles, disinherited knights, and adventurers with nothing left to lose, a force that would come to call itself the Alliance of the Disinherited. Part 9: The War for the Stepstones. In the year 105 AC, Daemon Targaryen flew Caraxes over the Stepstones for the first time, beginning a war that would stretch on for years. It was not a war of grand battles beneath bright banners. It was a slow, grinding campaign of ambushes and sieges, fought in blistering heat across beaches where the tide erased the blood before it could stain the sand for long. The Triarchy's forces were commanded by Craghas Drahar, known to the smallfolk in dread as the Crabfeeder, a man who knew the caves, gullies, and hidden coves of the Stepstones better than any chart could show. Direct assaults on his fortified positions proved disastrous. Hidden archers and crossbowmen turned every approach into a slaughter, so Daemon changed tactics entirely. He led small bands of marines and mercenaries through the same underground passages the Triarchy used against him, hunting the hunters in total darkness, using the island's honeycomb of tunnels against the very men who had built their strategy around them. The war stretched through 106, 107, and 108 AC, years of brutal attrition that tested Daemon's resolve in ways nothing before ever had. Supplies ran thin. Fever claimed as many men as swords did. Corlys' ships grew weary of blockading ports that refused to fall. And through all of it, Daemon refused to retreat, refusing even to call on his brother for help, determined to die on those rocks rather than return to King's Landing having failed. The breaking point came on the beaches of Bloodstone, the largest of the Stepstones, where the Crabfeeder's forces had pulled back into a heavily fortified cove. Day after day, Daemon's men charged into a storm of arrows and bolts, only to be thrown back again and again. Rather than continue the slaughter, Daemon devised a final, desperate plan. Under cover of a moonless night, he led 100 of his best men through a sea cave that opened directly behind the Crabfeeder's lines, while Caraxes flew high above as a distraction, drawing enemy eyes skyward with bursts of flame. When Daemon emerged from the cave, the enemy camp was undefended from the rear. The fighting that followed was swift and brutal. Daemon found Craghas Drahar in his own command tent and killed him personally with Dark Sister. In the early spring of 109 AC, the war reached its true conclusion on the island of Grey Gallows, the Triarchy's last true stronghold. Daemon led a small band across a causeway the enemy had assumed impassable, and by dawn his forces stood at the gates of the fortress. The Crabfeeder's remaining defenders, already broken by his death, surrendered by midday. By this point in the campaign, Daemon had transformed almost entirely from the impatient, undisciplined young man who had first arrived in the Stepstones years earlier. War, it turned out, was the one arena of governance he had genuine talent for, perhaps the only kind of leadership that ever truly suited his temperament. Where the small council had bored him into recklessness, the brutal, immediate stakes of island warfare seemed to sharpen every instinct he possessed. He learned to read tides and currents the way other commanders read maps. He learned which of his men could be trusted with a dangerous night raid and which were better suited to holding a defensive line. He learned, above all, patience of a very specific and narrow kind, not the patience of ledgers and legal codes which he had never possessed, but the patience of a predator willing to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. Lord Corlys Velaryon, watching his younger ally develop over those difficult years, would later remark to his own household that he had expected to find in Daemon a reckless sword arm to complement his own fleet and fortune. What he found instead was something closer to a genuine strategic partner, reckless still, certainly, and prone to gambles that made the sea snake's blood run cold, but never foolish. Every seemingly impulsive decision Daemon made in those final campaigns was, in fact, the product of weeks of careful observation. The raid that killed the crabfeeder himself had been planned for nearly a month beforehand, built on intelligence gathered by scouts Daemon had personally trained to move through the island's cave systems without being seen. It was, in its own strange way, the making of the man the rest of his life would be built upon. The rogue prince who would later organize dragon squadrons and coordinate a naval blockade during the Dance of the Dragons was not born in the halls of the Red Keep. He was forged, quite literally, in the caves and blood-soaked sand of the Stepstones. On that same beach, Lord Corlys Velaryon placed a simple, hastily forged circle of black iron upon Daemon's head and proclaimed him king of the Stepstones and the Narrow Sea. It was not the gold and jewels of the Iron Throne. It was a crown won entirely through blood, fire, and years of grinding war, and to Daemon, that made it more valuable than any inherited title could ever be. Part 10: A Crown Laid Down. News of Daemon's coronation reached King's Landing within a fortnight, and the small council was immediately divided. Otto Hightower argued that Daemon had effectively committed treason, declaring himself a king without the Iron Throne's consent. But Viserys, worn down by years of his brother's defiance and in some private corner of himself, perhaps even quietly proud of the fire Daemon had shown, chose reconciliation instead. He sent a raven acknowledging Daemon as the rightfully anointed king of the Stepstones, though he made clear the realm remained one, and that Daemon held his crown only by the grace of the Iron Throne. In the summer of 111 AC, during a grand tourney held in King's Landing, Daemon made a stunning, deliberate gesture. In front of the entire assembled court, Caraxes descended into the middle of the tourney grounds, scattering horses and startled knights. Daemon dismounted, walked calmly through the stunned crowd, climbed the steps to the royal box and knelt before his brother. He placed the crown of the Stepstones at Viserys' feet and declared that there was only one true king in Westeros, and that he was surrendering his crown and his sword to him. The gesture was, in its way, brilliant political theater, humble in appearance but unmistakably a bid for renewed standing at court. Viserys, moved despite himself, rose and embraced his brother in front of the entire realm. For a few precious months afterward, the Targaryen family stood genuinely united. Daemon visited his young nieces, dined at his brother's table, even sat in on a small council meeting once more. It seemed briefly that the rogue prince had finally found his place. That peace, like the tides of the Stepstones themselves, was never going to last. Part 11: Scandal in the Maiden Vault. By the time Daemon returned fully to court life following his public surrender, whispers had already begun to spread, dangerous, damaging rumors concerning his relationship with his young niece, Princess Rhaenyra, now the officially recognized heir to the Iron Throne. Rhaenyra was still a child, only around 8 years old at the time, but she was already sharp, bold, and unmistakably Targaryen in temperament. Daemon recognized something of himself in her, a hunger for fire and freedom that the rest of the court seemed determined to suppress. What followed became known, in hushed and disapproving tones throughout the Red Keep, as Daemon's lessons to the young princess. Private time spent together, sometimes within the Maiden Vault, the secluded tower meant to shelter the king's female relatives from the outside world. He reportedly told her stories of dragons and conquest, spoke to her of the Targaryen right to rule not through law but through fire, encouraged her to see herself as above the ordinary rules that bound other highborn women. The rumors, whatever their exact truth, reached Otto Hightower, who brought them directly to King Viserys, framing Daemon as a man corrupting the mind of the future queen and treating the sanctity of the Maiden Vault as though it were his own private domain. Viserys summoned his brother for a confrontation behind sealed doors, one so heated that guards outside reported hearing raised voices and the crash of a goblet against stone. The next morning, Daemon was banished from court for a second time, stripped of every remaining title and honor, including his command of the city watch, and ordered back to his estranged wife in the Vale until the king decided otherwise. This banishment cut far deeper than the first. Viserys had always found ways to forgive his brother's provocations out of genuine love, but this time the target had been his own daughter, and no amount of affection could fully repair the damage. The relationship between the two brothers would never again be entirely without suspicion. Rhaenyra herself was questioned quietly by the Maesters in the aftermath, and by every surviving account, she denied that anything improper had occurred. Whether that denial reflected the honest truth of a young girl too naive to fully grasp the implications of what had been said about her, or whether it reflected a more knowing attempt to protect an uncle she had already grown deeply attached to, is a question the histories have never been able to settle. What is certain is that the scandal permanently altered how the court viewed both of them. Rhaenyra, still years away from ascending the throne, found herself the subject of a particular kind of scrutiny that young princes were rarely subjected to. Every friendship, every private conversation now viewed through the lens of what had allegedly happened in the Maiden Vault. For Daemon, the consequences were more immediate and more painful. He had by this point in his life been banished from King's Landing twice, stripped of nearly every title the crown had ever granted him, and reduced once again to the one role he had always been able to escape into: husband to a wife who barely tolerated his presence, exiled to a corner of the realm he had never stopped despising. And yet even in that low moment, something had shifted. Whatever the true nature of his bond with young Rhaenyra had been, it had planted a seed that would not fully bloom for another decade. A private understanding between uncle and niece that neither of them ever fully abandoned, no matter how many years, marriages, or wars came between them. Part 12: A Convenient Death. Daemon retreated to the Vale, but a critical obstacle still stood between him and any real independence. His marriage to Lady Rhea Royce still legally bound him, preventing any new match, any fresh claim to power entirely his own. Then in the 9th month of 109 AC, fate, or something less innocent, intervened. Rhea, an experienced rider and huntswoman in her own right, was thrown from her horse during a hunting expedition through the high mountain passes, striking her head against a jagged rock outcropping. She lingered unconscious for a fortnight before finally succumbing to her injuries. Given that Daemon was 1,000 miles away at the time, no formal accusation was ever raised, and the Lords of the Vale ultimately ruled the death a tragic accident. But the timing struck many across the realm as deeply suspicious, and the truth of what truly happened on that mountain trail has never been definitively settled. Whatever the cause, Daemon was now a widower, and he wasted no time acting on it. Within days he flew to Runestone, fully expecting to claim the Royce lands and castle by right of his marriage. Instead, he found the gates barred against him. The Lords of the Vale, who had never forgiven his years of open contempt for their region and their lady, refused to recognize his claim, instead granting Rhea's inheritance to a cousin. Daemon, for the first time in his adult life, chose retreat rather than force, recognizing that burning down a major house's ancestral seat would bring the full weight of the crown down on him with no one left to protect him. Part 13: Lena Pentos and a Season of Peace. Free now of his first marriage, Daemon turned his attention toward Driftmark, where Lady Lena Velaryon, daughter of Lord Corlys and Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, and rider of the massive dragon Vhagar, waited. Bold, fierce, and utterly unintimidated by his reputation, Lena had watched Daemon crown Rhaenyra Queen of Love and Beauty at the earlier tourney, and had felt the same restless energy that drew others to him. Corlys, ever the pragmatist, saw the match as a way to bind the Velaryon bloodline even closer to the crown, and gave his blessing without hesitation. The wedding itself was a quiet, modest affair held on the shores of Driftmark, without royal permission or a grand feast in King's Landing. When Viserys learned of the marriage after the fact, his fury was cold and total. To him, it was not simply a political slight but a direct act of defiance, especially coming so soon after the scandal involving Rhaenyra. Before the wedding celebrations had even fully concluded, word arrived from King's Landing that Daemon was banished once again, this time ordered to leave Westeros entirely. Daemon did not hesitate. He gathered his new wife and a small retinue and sailed for the free cities of Essos, settling eventually in Pentos, where old allies from the Stepstones campaign still remembered him fondly. There, in a grand manse overlooking the sea, surrounded by gardens of lemon and olive trees, Daemon and Lena lived through what would prove to be the calmest years of his entire life. In 115 AC, Lena gave birth to twin daughters, Baela and Rhaena, both healthy, both marked by the same silver hair and violet eyes that ran through the Targaryen bloodline. For the first time, Daemon had something to protect that was entirely, uncomplicatedly his own, and by every account he doted on his daughters with a tenderness few in Westeros would have expected of him. The days in Pentos passed in a rhythm of leisure and spectacle, Daemon and Rhaena flying Caraxes and Vhagar together above the harbor, their massive shadows sweeping over fishing boats as crowds gathered to watch two dragons twist and dive together in the open sky. It was, by every account that survives, the closest thing to true contentment Daemon ever experienced. He was for the first time in his life, free of a small council he despised, free of a brother who alternately loved and distrusted him, free even of the endless political calculations that had governed nearly every relationship he had ever built. In Pentos he was simply a husband and a father, watching his daughters grow, hunting in the hills outside the city, hosting merchant princes and old comrades from the Stepstones campaign who still remembered him fondly enough to seek out his company. Baela and Rhaena grew up in that manse largely untouched by the darker currents that would later define their family's history. They knew their father as a man who carried them on his shoulders through the courtyard gardens, who told them stories of dragons rather than warnings about court politics, who seemed, in those years at least, entirely unburdened by the reputation that preceded him everywhere in Westeros. It is one of the more striking contrasts in Daemon's life story. The same man capable of ordering brutal violence against his enemies proved, in this quieter chapter, to be a genuinely devoted and tender father, a side of him that the wars and scandals of his younger years had rarely given anyone the chance to see. But peace, as always, could not hold Daemon forever. He began sending careful ravens back to his brother, testing whether the door back to Westeros had cracked open even slightly. And in 120 AC, Rhaena became pregnant once more, a pregnancy that would end not in celebration, but in a tragedy that would shatter the fragile calm of their exile for good. Part 14, Tragedy at Driftmark. By 120 AC, Corlys Velaryon had long since forgiven Daemon for past transgressions, and the family had returned to Driftmark so that Rhaena might be attended by the finest maesters available. The pregnancy proved difficult from the start. Rhaena, now in her late 20s and already having delivered twins once before, insisted on carrying the child to term regardless of the risk. The labor began on a stormy night, and it did not go well. The Maesters reported a breech birth and bleeding that would not stop. In her final moments, Rhaena, ever the dragon rider, asked to be carried to Vhagar one last time, wanting to feel the wind before the end, but she was already too weak to be moved. The child, a stillborn son, was delivered moments before Rhaena herself died, her eyes fixed on the window where she could see her dragon's silhouette circling above the castle. Daemon was at her side when she passed. He did not weep where anyone could see him. He simply took her hand, kissed her forehead, and said something to her that no one present ever repeated. Rhaena's funeral, held according to Velaryon tradition, her body set adrift on a burning ship upon the tides, drew the entire Targaryen family together in mourning for the first time in years. King Viserys attended with Queen Alicent Hightower and their children. Rhaenyra came as well with her husband Laenor Velaryon and their own young sons. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension beneath the grief. It was that same night after the funeral had ended that the next crisis unfolded. Among the children gathered at Driftmark was Prince Daemon Targaryen, the second son of Viserys and Alicent, a boy of about 10 who, unlike his siblings, had no dragon of his own, a source of deep personal shame. In the darkness, restless and grieving, he found Vhagar wandering alone, mourning her lost rider. Daemon approached the massive dragon, and to everyone's shock, Vhagar allowed him to climb onto her back. With a roar that shook the castle, the boy claimed the largest living dragon in the world for himself. When he landed, the other children confronted him, furious that he had taken a dragon that wasn't his to claim. Words turned to blows, and in the chaos, young Lucerys Velaryon, only 7 years old, drew a knife and slashed Daemon across the face, carving a deep gash from brow to chin that cost the boy an eye permanently. The fallout was immediate and bitter. Queen Alicent demanded that Lucerys be punished in equal measure, but Viserys, grieving, exhausted, and unwilling to further split his family, refused. Rhaenyra defended her son fiercely. And Daemon, watching from the shadows, said nothing at all, though his silence in that moment spoke volumes about what he already understood was coming. The wound to Daemon's face and to his pride would never fully heal, and it hardened the divide between the two branches of the family, the Greens, loyal to Alicent and her children, and the Blacks, loyal to Rhaenyra, into something that could no longer be repaired through gestures or reconciliation. Part 15, The Secret Wedding. Within weeks of Rhaena's funeral, and barely a month after the death of Rhaenyra's own husband, Laenor, under circumstances that were never fully explained, Daemon and Rhaenyra made a decision that shocked even their closest allies. They married in a secret ceremony at Dragonstone, witnessed only by a handful of trusted household members and a septon whose silence had been purchased with gold. It was a marriage built on genuine old attraction, but also on cold political calculation. By marrying Rhaenyra, Daemon brought his own loyalists, the gold cloaks who still remembered his command fondly, and ties to the Valyrian fleet through his daughters, directly into her camp. And crucially, it gave Rhaenyra heirs of unquestionably pure Targaryen and dragon blood, at a time when whispers about the true parentage of her older sons by Laenor had already begun to circulate through the court. When news of the marriage reached King's Landing, King Viserys was furious, not primarily because he disapproved of the match itself, but because it had been made entirely without his consent, and because it signaled that Rhaenyra was no longer content simply to wait quietly for the throne. She was actively building a power base of her own with Daemon as its center. The Green faction, led by Queen Alicent and her father Otto, condemned the marriage as an abomination. Uncle and niece, they argued, even as Targaryen tradition had long permitted marriages between siblings. Within a year, Rhaenyra was pregnant, and in 121 AC she gave birth to a son they named Aegon. The following year came a second son, Viserys, named for the grandfather who had once loved his family so dearly but could now barely stand the sight of his own brother. These two boys secured Rhaenyra's claim in a way nothing else could, ensuring that her succession wouldn't die with her, and giving Daemon at long last the dynasty he had always craved.